Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the October 2020 edition of SMAF. My name is Don Robinson. I'm one of the co-hosts of the show and the technical provider today. I have a few hiccups with the old technology, hence I'm reshooting the intro and just making a properly framed beginning to our excellent edition for this month. Now, Tim was having a chat with Eric about forthcoming planning for Streaming Media West. So I'm going to take you now to join them, and apologies for one or two other technical hiccups.
Better for the event in terms of its location and being central to attendees and speakers, but boy, I'm going to miss that beach. How about you, Tim?
Yeah, me too. Running across the street to the beach, or actually over the bridge to the beach, was a nice sort of break. It's a little further from downtown LA to go to any of the beaches out there, but like you said, it's close. It's closer into the industry, so we'll see. Now, you've also been working on a reader survey. Is that correct?
I have, yeah. In fact, we're doing a reader survey. We do this every year, although we actually missed last year. And we are looking to, get a better sense of who our readers are, what their interests are, what their purchasing power is. And so if you go to streamingmedia.com and you go to the blog, you can find a link to that reader survey. If you get any of our email newsletters, you've already received a link to it. And we sure would appreciate you taking a few minutes and filling that out. It only takes about 3 minutes, and it certainly helps us do a better job of hopefully serving you when you read the magazine and the website.
And I think there's a prize as well if people put their email address in.
There is a $100 Amazon gift card for that. So,
all right, early Christmas shopping.
Exactly.
I've actually been wrapping up. Sorry, go ahead, Eric.
No, and I did just want to throw in before we move on from Streaming Media West that we do have all of our keynotes confirmed. The last one confirmed recently. The first keynote is Sandeep Gupta, who is the Vice President of Fire TV and Devices at Amazon Fire TV. For the second day's keynote, we have Kiran Paranjape, who's the Head of Sports and Entertainment for Global Partnerships at Google. He's going to be having a fireside chat with Brendan Riley of NASCAR and Rich Robinson of the World Surf League, talking about sports streaming. And then to close things out for our closing presentation, we have a return from last year. Roger Pantos from Apple is going to be talking about low latency HLS, which was something that was certainly quite the buzz at IBC last month.
Yeah, and I would add in, Roger Pantos coming and doing either an opening keynote or a closing keynote. There's always really good information that he provides. As the father of HLS, is sort of has a unique perspective on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I was going to say too that we finished up the state of streaming survey, and I'm working through now culling responses, that might be obviously fake or something like that. But we've got some really interesting data, and Eric and I, we're going to discuss whether or not it makes sense to present some of that at Streaming Media West as well. But we should have preliminary findings on that within the next probably week and a half.
Excellent. Any idea when that's going to be published, or is that kind of up in the air?
I think that's up in the air and based on the sponsor, but I would suspect that if we're going to do something at Streaming West, it would come out probably the first week in November as a tease before the show, the third week in November.
Sounds good.
Dom, I'm going to hand back to you real quick. You can mention about multiple guests and how we've got the more intelligent of the two, but just in case, just to give a heads up in case somebody else does pop in, and then you can go ahead and introduce.
I don't think that's fair. I think the rate of change within the SMAF technical infrastructure, I think anyone struggles to keep up. So I'm just messaging backwards and forwards with one of our guests who's just having a little technical fire. There's unfortunately the calendar invite we use to invite our guests includes a Google Meet link, which often leads people astray, and so he's been set on that, and I'm just repointing him, so hopefully he'll join us soon. And I do want to talk more about IBC, actually. I think there's a lot to talk about from IBC. But before we do that, Tim, why don't you take us over to our first guest in the hot seat for representing the women in streaming media as well. So Tim, go and find out who our guest is, please.
Sure, certainly. Actually, go ahead, Virginia, and speak up and introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your company and how long you've been in the industry.
Hi, yes. Hi, I'm Virginia Juliano. I'm the founder and CEO of a startup called Chord. We help people cobble together personalized streaming bundles so that they can get more out of streaming and get rid of cable. That's sort of our tagline. And I've been at Chord. We launched in late 2016. But prior to that, I was a marketing and distribution executive at Showtime Networks for 10 years and led the go-to-market strategy and implementation for their streaming service. And in the process, was exposed to a ton of research, and it really validated some of my thinking prior about, where this industry was headed, and that it was all about streaming. And I also realized that with all these streaming services launching, and at that time it was just a fraction actually of what we have now, and we couldn't keep it all straight. And we were in the business and we lived and breathed it every day. So a light bulb went on for me, and I said, if we can't keep it straight, then consumers are going to need help. And so I set out to sort of build something that was very simple, that could help the average consumer, not just the early adopter, really understand their options out there and I distilled it down to some very simple questions. And we have a patented process and some proprietary algorithms and database that tells people these are the streaming services you should cobble together based on your content, device, and price preferences, which is really what it's about, in my opinion.
And that's fascinating. I'm going to come back around and talk a little bit about that here later, because the cobblings, what is it, Jeopardy, where they'll have like one word and then a word in the middle and then another word. For yours, it could almost be Chord-Cutting. Because essentially you're helping somebody cobble together what they would have had on cable, but doing it through OTT. Okay, awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely come back around to that. So Dom, you mentioned that you wanted to talk a little bit about IBC, and I know that's something that a number of us were at the show. What was your take on the show this year?
Oh, you beat me to the question. I wanted to ask you that first. Yeah, so as I put in the article in the magazine this month, I had gone there with a bit of anticipation that I was going to see some change underneath the hood of the industry, if you like. Although the veneer, I think, is very much promoting the sort of high-end growth in the big plays, and the Disneys and the Netflixes and the big content plays. That actually, I think that at a mid and a lower tier of the industry, I think there's quite a lot of change and repositioning happening, and I think I was more vindicated in that than I was expecting when I went to IBC. I found that was the tone of everyone's conversation. The big sales guys I know were all moving to specific IP first sort of positions, moving away from the traditional broadcast space and finding long-term positions, long-term roles in the streaming and IP space. I think there's a schism appearing. I think there's lots of companies selling very expensive solutions into an ever dwindling number of aggregated high-end broadcasters. So I think there's a high end of the mid-tier which are going to really have to restructure. They've raised funding, they've scaled themselves as if there's going to be hundreds and hundreds of Disney Plus services, and there's not. There's going to be just a relative few. So I think that's interesting. On the other end, though, there's more growth in the low end prosumer end of the market, where and as I put in the magazine, I think that the user-generated content is going to come of age. I think we've always dismissed that as being, you know, kids unboxing videos and sort of niche chaff. But actually, I think that increasingly we're seeing people making thousands. In fact, a little later on, I'd like to talk a bit more about one of the other stories I shared, which is about the sort of explosion in podcasting. But there are dozens, if not hundreds, of independent 2-man, 3-man band podcasters who are making hundreds of thousands, if not millions a year out of successful niche podcasts. And I think that space is coming of age. And I think that the technical vendors who are selling into the high end of the market would do well to also have a prosumer level of technology that they can offer to independents and home broadcasters and so on. So I was kind of buoyed up, actually. Hey, we have our other guests arrive, but we have some way to go before that transition's fully over. And I think the next 12 months we're going to see some of the tier 2 OTT plays fail, and I think there'll be some finger pointing at the negative aspects of streaming because all these high investment vehicles will have failed. But actually, what we're probably not going to have if we're not careful, we'll take our eye off the ball and miss the hundreds of thousands of people who are starting to mature podcasting and niche video propositions to a point that they're going to start really working and becoming a significant income for people.
So let's come back around to that in a minute here. Let me actually ask Virginia a question about something you said before we go on and introduce our other guest who just popped in. But Virginia, Dom mentioned, you know, the sort of idea of companies in the broadcast space, whether NAB shows or IBC shows, selling to what they think would be hundreds of Disney Pluses or Netflix or Amazon Primes. You mentioned, of course, that, you know, when you started looking at this with the research, it was confusing to you as somebody who is in the industry, clearly confusing to consumers. What's your take on that? Do you expect that we will end up with a lot of sort of major OTT services like NBC, like CBS, like HBO, like Showtime, or will it be a dozen or so of those, and like Dom saying, you get hundreds of thousands of sort of niche, smaller players in the market?
Well, I think that there is a limit on these Disney Plus, size streaming services. We're not going to have, hundreds of those. Those are expensive to create content for, to scale, and to market. So I think there's definitely a cap on how many of those will exist healthily. But I do think, and echoing what Dom said, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for these smaller and mid-tier services that serve specific niches and really super serve to their customers, and can perhaps create sort of an ecosystem around it and community to reinforce it. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I also would line up, historically with the cable ecosystem. When it first came out, there was a lot of talk about, do we really need hundreds of channels? And, there were some that floated to the top, and with larger of that group, the economics nowadays are not as favorable for some of those smaller ones because, of how they were previously bundled. And that's a whole other discussion, bundling and bundle backlash and how bundles have, gouged consumers over the last several years. But I think that there's a lot of room. There's a lot of room for opportunity for services that have not overextended themselves, have smart business models, smart financials, and, are careful about how they invest in content, particularly.
So it's interesting that you mentioned the bundles, and that's a soapbox for me. We'll stay away from it for a second. But one thing I wanted to sort of riff on that you mentioned here was you talked about how, in the early days of cable, we were thinking maybe it would be 60 channels at most, and then it became a 500 channel universe. I must have felt like I have a friend who started several of the small. He started TNN, the Nashville Network, CMT, and a number of others, which obviously then were sold up to CBS and then Viacom. And then he went off and looked at other ones like Turner South, which had a lower number of eyeballs, but was able to help them build it up to where they became sort of, must carry, not really must carry, but large enough. Do we see a model similar to that in the OTT space, where we may have not curators necessarily, but somebody who's expert in actually drawing eyeballs work with a niche group to then grow them into a must subscribe model, like a?
Well, I think we're starting to see, the aggregators.
Plagued with the technicals today. Oh my God.
And Dom, you have an echo. Well, I think it's not a technology week at all. Chris, if you can hear me, go ahead and speak up and introduce yourself. I don't think he can. I can see him, but I can't hear. So somebody send Chris a message and let him know. Virginia, let's actually talk real quick. So you were starting to say, my question was, will we see people who sort of handhold small viewership OTT services and build them up? And you said we're starting to see aggregators.
We're starting to see aggregators come into the space who are trying to do some of that. And that's but within their own platforms. And actually what Chord is doing is trying to help people discover, the myriad of streaming services that are available to them. So we're trying to come in and solve for that a bit too. But I heard it described also, I didn't make this up, but I'm borrowing it. No one is saying these days, we can't have any more websites. There's too many websites.
Fair point.
It's all about choice and options. And then, smart businesses like Chord are trying to come in there and help facilitate it for consumers.
Well, and what's interesting about that is, from a technology standpoint, cable was limited at first to a certain number of channels. Obviously, over the air was limited to a certain number of channels, VHF and then UHF. Cable was limited, and then as we figured out how to expand the number of channels on cable. But given the fact that it's IP, you're absolutely right. You could have, 2 billion channels if you wanted to, because you're only going to be watching any one at a given time.
Right. And now, every streamer, I say, is like a snowflake, okay? Not everyone is going to want, the combination of streaming services that your neighbor would want. So the possibilities and the iterations are endless in this world.
So with those niches, though, how do you get people to pay for that? So you're in that unique position as a Meta because, you're helping people cobble together services. Let's say, for instance, your local high school football league wants to start charging for it. Is there a point at which you, if you were advising, say, the local high school league or even the state high school league, that they would have to have N number of viewers to be able to sort of justify having a subscription service? Or do we expect a lot of this stuff just will continue for free, and then it's whether you can find it or not?
Well, I think that there's tremendous opportunity for ad-supported models that are essentially free then for consumers. And you're seeing around the industry some interesting business models, creative business models. And that's an opportunity too.
Okay. All right. Good. Chris, I think we can suddenly hear you now. Can you hear us?
I can hear you now.
Fantastic. All right. Well, welcome to this technically challenged edition of SMAF, including both your technical challenges and mine and Dom's and apparently the entire internet's.
Well, it's a new development by Dom, isn't it? So it's bound to have some teething troubles. But I think it's. I didn't mean it the way that came out.
No, of course, you meant it exactly the way that it came out, and we all agree.
Well,
That's okay. I can take that on the chin. I'm not a bad techie for a biz dev
yeah,
guy.
absolutely. You're much better than I am. That's for sure. No, but it takes me back to what you were saying earlier about multiple channels and whether we're going to be looking at multiple Netflix or lots of small organizations. And I think what you've managed to do with this application, Dom, is prove what people are going to do in the future. There's going to be a lot of channels like this where people will get to become very technical and will be able to develop their own TV channels because people like you can do it. I mean, we've now got people from around the world all having a conversation on an international channel. Imagine if the BBC or Sky or CNN were trying to do this. It would be costing hundreds of thousands of dollars for them to put the infrastructure in place to be able to get the satellites, to get the crews around the world to actually be able to manage the infrastructure to do what you've done with a couple of bits of string and a couple of fag packets. You're absolutely amazing, Dom. That's what I think about what's going on with the industry.
And I gather, Chris, you're sitting in a vehicle as well, so you're doing this on a mobile device.
Yep, I'm doing this on a mobile phone. I'm on the way to a client. I knew I couldn't miss this client meeting, so I've called in at a lay-by. It was lovely and sunny when I started. I was sitting outdoors in the sunshine. It started to rain because it's England, so I came back into the car, and my beautiful scenic view that I had lined up for you is behind me now.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and your time in the industry.
Right, well, started in '95. I set the business up as a streaming media company, as a audio-only media company, and we were producing audio tapes for people like Sun Microsystems, and all of their salespeople were saying, we don't want your productions, we don't want them on cassette tapes, we'd like them on CD because we've got expensive posh cars that can play CDs. So we were looking around for technology to squeeze the audio onto CDs, found Real Networks, and that took us into becoming eventually a Real Networks reseller and the first UK Real Networks distributor. So quite a few of the early guys in the UK were clients of ours because we sold them the Real Networks technology. That went on to streaming concerts like Robbie Williams from Slane Castle, and to do events like Madonna from Brixton Academy, and we became quite well known for doing concerts, and we did a lot of corporate events, and eventually Microsoft bought the company and then sold the technology for BBC, which became BBC iPlayer. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So,
Tim, you're muted, but Chris and I have known each other for a long time. He's one of those people you bump into and you go, how come I haven't bumped into you earlier on today?
and I'm going to say that we all have a real intersection in our background. It seems like those of us who have been in the industry more than 15 years or so.
And there's quite a few others. There's quite a few others.
Absolutely. One of the things that's fascinating, just as an aside on this, I had a conversation with Yuri Resnick at IBC. Yuri was one of the original real codec guys, and he told me that they were able to accomplish everything that they did at Real essentially with 5 people on the codec team. He said it wasn't a codec team of hundreds. It was a codec team of people who knew how to work together really well. 1 audio guy, 4 video guys, and they were able to accomplish a very significant amount. So
yeah, it is amazing. I saw a post on LinkedIn today. Some organization had done an outside broadcast and were really impressed with themselves and made a big story about it, how they managed to squeeze all of their equipment into a Mercedes Sprinter van. Now, it's not a very large van, and quite impressive. Now, we had one guy called Chris Garlick, who's an absolute electrical genius. He developed our OB truck, and what was in the van was all of the equipment. We had 8 live cameras, 8 screens for an 8-camera live OB truck, and that cost us less than £100,000. Now, that was what we were doing way back in 95, 96. We did the opening of the Scottish Parliament with that. It was the first time the Queen was broadcast live on the internet, and we were quite pleased with that. And the BBC were amazed that what we had was this tiny little van turned up, and we had BBC technicians for the whole 3 days that we were up in Edinburgh coming to look at our van. And things haven't really... I kind of feel that things haven't moved on a lot in the industry. There's a few companies like LiveView who've done fantastic stuff with mobile streaming and live broadcasting with mobile kit, and absolutely amazed at how brilliant LiveView technology is and the companies that are using it. But it was very small budget in those days, and we did accomplish some amazing things literally with a handful of people and no money.
Well, and I think you bring up an interesting point that we've sort of evolved, but we really haven't hit any sort of major revolutionary points. I think this kind of thing where you talk about people from multiple locations, different geographies around the world, is sort of the next natural step in streaming. But it's also very much like what video conferencing was 25 years ago when I left video conferencing and went into streaming. I guess the difference here is you don't need specialized equipment. You can do it with, like you on a mobile phone, the rest of us on laptops or desktops. Dom, I know you love to tell stories about the early days as well. You had a truck also, and I think you brought it to help us one point at Streaming Media Europe in London. What were the kinds of typical gigs that you would do with that? I mean, are they similar to what Chris was doing, or were they, sort of smaller projects that somebody who wanted to have an expensive birthday party would live stream to their grandmother who couldn't come?
Yeah, no, they were generally, in fact, the earlier you go back, the more high profile the events were. Originally we were using it for doing sort of live links from Fatboy Slim gigs, or live links for Duke of Edinburgh's awards with, royalty hanging around, or fashion. We did some early Fashion Week stuff. So they were all quite, in their own right, they were quite good gigs. And as time went on and the competition grew, I found myself doing more and more smaller gigs, and then people started pulling out their phones and streaming things. And those very small gigs, kind of that work went in-house. I guess this harks back to what I was saying earlier. I think that over the last 20 years, the ability for people to generate good content themselves has increased. So from my point of view, working in frontline production has become either a fine art, like Mark, who's normally here, at the very high end, but for the mid-tier stuff, for the awards ceremonies, for those sort of ad hoc events which get, relatively few viewers, it tends to be the budgets are just getting compressed all the time. It's just the way it is.
So I want to mention one other quick thing from IBC, and then we're going to talk about a couple Flipboard topics. We don't have them on our list anymore because of the crash.
By the way, I'm just going to interrupt Tim. Tim, I'm just going to interrupt for a second. I think we should run over a little bit given the technical start. So those of you that are joining late, okay, you've missed some technical shenanigans, and we're going to let it run over for as long as the guests can manage 10 or 20 minutes or something.
Okay. I wanted to mention just briefly, obviously Virginia is our representative this month for women in streaming media. At IBC, there was an event that Dom and I attended. Eric wasn't able to attend, which was the Women in Streaming Media meetup. And as I understand, they also had one in New York that was actually quite well attended. There were two other groups that I think we didn't talk about. I wrote a column about the IBC, Women in Streaming Media, but Bea Alonso, who we've had on before, also is a representative of a group called Ring. And Ring has been around for quite a while. It's broadcast women, so it's women in broadcast. That group, interestingly, has had a sort of parallel path to women in streaming. It tends to be more people who've been in the industry 20 to 25 years, as opposed to the nascency of streaming. Even though we've been around for 20 years on it, a lot of people have only been in the industry a few years. And then there's another group, and Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, Kaltura is doing meetups as well around what they're looking for on the diversity side. They had a happy
hour at IBC, but that was adjacent to, they're making a push for gender equality in technology in general. They've got a petition running. Streaming Media is a media partner or supporting partner in that. To be honest, what comes next, I don't know, but I do know that Kaltura itself has made a commitment to both gender equality and broader diversity within its HR department and within hiring practices. And they've got a goal. They've actually set, and I don't have it handy, they've actually set a percentage goal for having women in executive and management positions by 2022 or something like that. So I think they're trying to lead by example.
Good.
And it's great to see this variety of initiatives coming forth and tackling the problem from different angles.
And I think one of the things that really impressed me at the Women in Streaming Media event at IBC was they talked about the mentorship program. And of course, Megan, who we had on last month, was one of the people who spearheaded that's key in terms of being able to not just have diversity, but also in bringing the training forward for a number of the young women that are coming into the space as well. So, Virginia, do you want to add anything on that before we go on to other topics?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great organization. I'm really happy to be involved with it, and my friend and colleague Peggy Dow, who's very highly involved in the organization. We just had an event in New York last week, a happy hour, and I got to meet a lot of, which was really nice, younger women getting into the streaming space, and from all different avenues, technology, engineering, even writers and actors, and it was a really nice way to meet and exchange ideas and advice.
Awesome. Very good. All right. So one of the topics we had was the cat in the art gallery. Dom, explain this to me.
Well, I think that was kind of my initial proposition just before we had our little technical failover earlier, which is that I think the analogy that I was using at IBC this year was the industry's a bit like a cat in an art gallery, in as much as we're all staring at at a laser pointer someone's waving around, and that laser pointer being the launch of Disney Plus, and I think the industry's very distracted by that. While actually we're in the middle of an art gallery, and there's lots of art going on and lots of creativity going on using video tools in lots of other places other than specifically in the very high end that Forbes, if you like, is pointing everyone to. And I think that the fact that those big investments and big movements are happening, yes, of course, that's going to attract the broadsheet financial news. But I think it's easy to forget that the vast majority of streaming, like Chris and I have been talking about earlier, is actually happening in e-gaming, in people streaming, what do you call it, FaceTime Live, YouTube Live, like we are here, those sort of things. I think there's an enormous amount of that content being generated. So really, I think we've kind of talked about the core content.
That's an excellent point. I'll just add, I'm not a financial advisor, but it seems like a great time to buy Netflix stock, because Netflix has been getting hammered on the anticipation. And even if Disney does well, I don't think there's a limited budget that people will spend if they really want the content. Having said that, as a segue to one of our other topics, there was a Flipboard article about U.S. households with 2 or more OTT services rising. Eric, do you want to touch on that one briefly?
Well, yeah, and that's one that actually Virginia had pointed out some research.
Oh, sorry.
Some recent Parks Associates research showed that about a third of broadband U.S. households have 2 or more OTT services. That was in 2017. Now it's up to about 46% have 2 or more. And along with that was the data point that the number of OTT services available in the U.S. has increased by 140% in 5 years, which, I don't know, to me, I mean, I agree with what Virginia said before our technical difficulties, that with the right guidance and the right information, that consumers can assemble their own mini bundles. They're not paid for as a single bundle, but, you know, that's essentially what people are doing. But you still have to wonder if we're headed towards some sort of a bubble in terms of the amount of investment and number of services that are out there and are going to be available to thrive. And I think that also circles back to Dom's point. You know, which is indicative of sort of this Silicon Valley. It has to scale infinitely to be a value mentality that so many people seem to be chasing, rather than paying attention to how smaller services can thrive and survive. So, I mean, certainly we're going to see some attrition, but I do think Virginia's right that with the right information that these niche services can survive. And then beyond that are the things that Dom talked about, which aren't even going to be packaged as services as such. Shows like this one, shows like the Dan TDM and the Odd Ones Out and these YouTubers that my kids watch that don't necessarily have any real ambitions of becoming an OTT player in the way that we in the industry think about them.
Right. And also, using Netflix as an example and how, you know, they've taken a hit with Disney Plus, you know, launching the looming launch. Netflix themselves said, or, you know, the CEO said, we're not really competing against these other streaming services. We're competing against all these other options out there, gaming in particular. And, there's a finite amount of time and attention that everyone has. And so they're actually seeing that it's really not even about a Disney Plus or whomever is in, on deck. It's a bigger challenge to break through for attention and time.
It's like when I did a project with Coca-Cola years ago, people would say they competed against Pepsi. This was before they had Dasani, the water. What they basically said in their corporate annual report that year was, if everybody in the world consumes 64 ounces of liquids a day, we only account for 2 ounces of that total 64. So we need to expand our market share. And that's ultimately why they introduced the Dasani water, which didn't cannibalize sales. It grew the market significantly. Dom, you started to have an opinion, but we wanted to let Virginia give hers. So what was yours?
I can't remember the point. I think I was what I was noticing on the Flipboard, that one of the articles that was almost adjacent to the Parks Associated one is that new streamings are turning viewers towards piracy, and I think that it's sort of this idea that launching more and more top tier broadcast collections that people can subscribe to. And that people will pay to, if they're freemium sponsored, I don't think they've got any value. I think if they're subscriber sponsored and you subscribe to a Netflix, you tend to sort of stay within that ecosystem a little bit. But if you're looking for something that's not in that ecosystem, I think there is more inclination to pirate. There is more inclination to find it free or find an alternative version. Or frankly, just don't bother if you can't find it. But I think that the value outside of those subscriber platforms is really questionable at the moment.
A lot of these kids are not watching what we call programs anyway. They're watching stuff that's of interest to them. So some of these kids are watching programs about fashion. They're following these, what they call influencers. They could be celebrity influencers. I mean, it's anathema to me. You've got these people called celebrity influencers. I mean, who even are they? And they just seem to be sisters of pop stars or somebody like that who decide that they're going to promote a fashion brand, and then they become an icon for that fashion brand. and they're turning into marketing campaigns for retail networks. So we've got retailers in the UK that are using influencers to promote their products for design houses. And so these are channels, this is sort of programming that my children are watching in their bedrooms at night. They're not waiting for the next episode of Upstart Crow or the next program from Ben Elton or any interesting program that anyone else would want to watch. It's so niche now.
Yeah, and I totally agree, Chris. And if I was going to spend, if I was sitting on a $30 million marketing budget for Pepsi and I wanted to target a bunch of teenage girls, I'd spend. I think I'd more readily spend $3 million on an influencer who had a direct hook into that market, and I could measure the success of my ad campaign, than I would throw $30 million away on the Super Bowl sponsorship, which I think those days are gone. I just think those days of premium major sponsorship are gone.
And Instagram TV is,
sorry, Virginia.
Instagram TV is becoming a very viable, outlet, and
absolutely,
it is essentially a streaming service. It's on its own, and it's connected with a social network. And that, once again, is competing for time and attention, and also just to circle back to the Parks Associates research. When I dug into it a little bit more, what I found really interesting, and this is consistent with the previous year, the fastest growing segment of streamers have 3 and over streaming services. So that's. And you can certainly see that, if you start adding in, the Instagram TVs of the world, that number is going to grow exponentially. So,
and I think what's interesting too, there was a study that came out a couple months ago that said the average person in the U.S. would buy N number of services as long as they didn't spend more than $21 a month. When you're looking at helping people cobble together services, is that number accurate? I mean, are people willing to spend $45, $50, $60 like they did on cable, or are they really sort of at that really price constrained point of $20 or less?
I love that question because the answer is it depends on who it is, right? And it also depends what time of year it is, what's happening in their life, what's going on with content. Is it something that they follow? So this is a moving target. It's not a set it and forget it world, I always say, with video anymore. It's not like you establish your bundle and that's your bundle. No, not anymore. It doesn't have to be. It could be like if you know you're going away on holiday for 3 months, you start, taking a look at your streaming services and you say, I don't need that, or I'll let that keep going, or so it's this constantly malleable array of services, and it has a lot of different levers that affect it. Price being one of them.
So let me ask about one of those levers. You mentioned people going away on holiday. Is there a model on particular OTT services that you can pause those like you could with your cell phone if you go abroad?
Actually, some of them allow for that. I know that YouTube TV here in the U.S. has that functionality. I think Netflix does as well. I mean, essentially, what's great about OTT, at least for now, is that there are no long-term contracts, so people can be more flexible with their lineup. I think a lot of the streaming services hope you forget that, and we plan to help sort of surface that that kind of thinking, because people should. And I think it's a mental shift also in the consumer's mind, at least the older consumers. The younger consumers totally get it, that they have control, but the older ones are used to sort of letting it ride, and they don't have to. And we're trying to help them make that easier for them.
And maybe one of the things for the older group as well is they might be afraid they'd lose their viewing history. I could almost see a business model for a company to store your viewing history. If you want to cancel the service, come back to it, a year later, and they'll resurface that for you.
That's a great idea. I'm writing that down.
Okay. Yeah, because that to me would be one of those things that as a stickiness, if I'm, if I finish up a series, but I have 2 other series that I've put in to remind me to watch, and then I want to cancel it for 2 months while I'm away on holiday, I would be afraid that I'd come back and I'd have to create a whole nother account if the service didn't let me suspend. If it suspends, the assumption is it's actually going to hold my viewing history. But if not, I really could see a model for a company to just get access to your viewing history and hold it.
And I can see a world where, services that allow for that sort of on and off boarding easily, that becomes a unique selling point and, competitive, claim. And as, I say also that content is almost becoming commoditized because there's so much of it, right? So now I think we're going to have these streaming services start competing on UX and certain features that make the user's life easier.
Agreed. Chris, a question for you, sort of along the lines, and something you had mentioned earlier. You're talking about, the influencers. I don't know how it is in the UK. In the US, for bloggers, there was a Wild West period where people could recommend things without saying, I'm, being compensated to do this, or I've been given a free copy of this. In the UK, when you're talking about, teenagers watching content, do they know that those people are being paid to actually be the celebrity influencer, or is that not clear in the content on the video front like it is in the blogging space?
Well, it's not clear in the video content. The bloggers don't actually say, hey, I'm being subsidized or sponsored by these people, so I'm going to tell you about the product. They don't say, I've got to fill the bank with ad dollars, so I'm going to tell you about these sneakers that have got nothing to do with the program. But the kids know that they're being sponsored, that these products are being sponsored, and the kids really do understand that the influencers are being paid, and they're doing the influencing because they're being paid. So the children know that quite well. I'm working on projects for the 5G generation now, which are basically kids that have got 5G on their mobile phones. And so if you're working in that space, you've got to be able to get enough revenue coming in, so you do tell people that you're sponsoring for this concert ticket, or you're sponsoring for this a given product. So the kids do know that it's being financed by advertising.
And so they're comfortable with being sold to because it's somebody they like, versus.
Yeah, if it's someone they like, and if it's a celebrity that they trust and they believe in. I mean, some of these people are just girls who slap makeup on, and they do programs about putting makeup on their face. And girls like to watch that, and so they watch it, and they buy the products that they're recommended by the person that they're following. Now, they know that they're being sold to, but they don't care. And there was a program on one of the BBC channels just recently where they interviewed young people, and they were talking to 18, 20-year-old guys and girls about the selling online. And they were going, but these kids were talking like proper grown-ups, and they were concerned about the 14-year-olds who may not know that stuff.
Right.
And they were going, they were then concerned that the 14-year-olds would get some kind of pamphlet or manual, when they all admitted quite confidently that they didn't know anything about the internet when they started viewing, when they got their smartphones moved from their Blackberries. And so they learnt by pressing buttons randomly to see what happened. That's how they found out. But now they're 18 and 19 and 20 and properly grown up. They were concerned that the 14-year-olds were being properly educated.
So, Eric, I know you're going to have to roll off here in just a minute, but what's your sense, as an American parent, in terms of this? You know how in the U.S. in our Saturday cartoons there was a clear delineation between the cartoon and the actual sponsorship. What's your sense with the online world and kids being able to understand they're being sold to?
I agree with Chris. I think most kids do understand. Although, as a parent, I've been sure to make it clear to my 10-year-old that EvanTube HD is getting all of those Legos for free. So I think obviously, there's not an external gatekeeper, but I think the kids are savvier than sometimes we give them credit for. So that's my take on it.
Okay. Anything to wrap up with real quick from your standpoint, since I know you got to roll off here in just a moment?
No, I wish I could stick around, but the technical difficulties mean an extended remix version, I guess, of SMAF today. So enjoy the next few minutes, and we'll see you next month.
All right, sounds good. So Dom, what's your take? You've got kids, and one of the things you've posited
your audio there
multiple times. Can you still hear me?
Just a minute. I don't know if you can hear me or not, but if you can, I will try to get my headphones working again. I think what I need to do. Let's just play. Go on, someone else take it for a second while I sort my audio out.
All right, sounds good. Virginia, go ahead.
I have some thoughts on that. I mean, I do think that kids are savvy. They're getting it, but I do think that the market will sort of weed out if this becomes too much of a thing. I mean, I personally find it really annoying, that all of these people are shilling, on social media, and it's tiresome to me, which makes me less inclined to get on these platforms. So perhaps, I'm in the minority, I'm not sure, but, I think that people will possibly reach, a saturation point on it where they'll just tune out because it's just getting too overwhelming.
I reached it in 2015 after having been on Facebook for almost 10 years. And I was off for a while, and I got back on about a year and a half ago, and it was so much more commercialized than it had been before. And even now, I'm sort of like, why do I use this platform?
Right. I mean, all the swipe up for my code, and it's just that's it's not why I was there. And I mean, perhaps that's where the younger set, they're fine with that, but I think they'll hit a wall on that as well, personally.
And I even think things like TikTok, which has become really big here in the States, but as Dom, I think, mentioned at IBC when we were talking, there are a number of those services that are actively being not regulated, Dom, but at least
there's a significant backlash. There's a significant backlash against TikTok in our sort of local schools community. It's too out of control, too little monitoring, too much sense that there's a lot of paedophiles hanging around on it. It's almost like parents find it on their kid's phone. It's got the same status that Snapchat had when it was at its worst. So yeah, it's sort of in the bin, really.
All right,
not going through my parental controls at the moment, anyway.
So as we start the wind down here, let's talk what's coming up. Dom, I know.
Sorry, I'm complimented that you call it a wind down. I never really found with this particular edition we got wound up. I've been stressing about technology left, right, and centre today. So huge and humble apologies to everyone, but that is because it's a streaming show about streaming.
Well, I've been helping Eric all week try to load Boot Camp on his iMac.
Right.
And I swear every time we try something, it should work. It absolutely should work. I'll send him terminal code strings, and they just don't work. And then I've had a bunch of technology issues with waiting for a new database that's being released today. And so, yeah, I just think this is a week of anti-technology.
Yeah. So let me hone us in on a couple of things just for the last. Let's go for it sort of till about 10 past, just to make up for the tech loss. So. Or at least until the steam runs out of this thread. So a couple of things that I think I'm going to see over the next sort of 12 weeks in conference season, and it's always busy this quarter in our sector. Lots of stuff happens. There's lots of outfall from IBC and people reposition, having got their marketing strategy all lined up, they then reposition themselves rapidly at the end of September to then go and hit the market properly in October and November. But there's a couple of things that I'm seeing at the moment. So big stories for me. I think that there's a big war going on in the audio and music space, and it's one of those niche markets that's worth hundreds of millions. So I think it's an interesting sector to watch. Amazon launched its lossless streaming tier, so they're making another play at the high-end sort of Tidal space in the audio sector. Spotify have countered, saying we're not really interested in quality as a differentiator. It doesn't seem to make any difference. What makes a difference is usability and function. So they've countered by allowing small feature, but about that you can now mix podcasts in with music playlists and so on. So they're clearly angling much more on continuing to make Spotify a more well integrated, more usable service. And for my own dollar, I'd place it on Spotify at the moment, because I think they're very much the Dropbox of their niche of subscriber music and so on. So I think there's some going to be more and more interesting stuff happening in the podcast space. I dropped mention of it right at the beginning of the session today, but I watched a nice 55-minute documentary that was put out on YouTube for International Podcast Day, which was last week, I think. And it's a 55-minute documentary which went round probably 20 or 30 different podcasters, just interviewing them about what they were doing, how they were set up, and what their business model was, and so on. I would say of the 20 podcasters they interviewed, every single one of them claimed to have more than $100,000 income annually from their podcast. One of them was claiming $19.5 million, but she was doing something kind of bizarre and unique over in Asia. So I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg with the podcasting market, and with Spotify and Amazon starting to really ramp up with the better integration of their subscriber services. I think that we're going to see more and more of that take over.
Well, and it's fascinating, Dom, that you say that, because, of course, podcasting's been around for 25 years almost at this point, and it goes through these waves. One thing that's fascinating when you say that about Spotify sort of allowing you to create a playlist that would have podcasts in the middle of music is Apple sort of owned that market for a while with iTunes, the integrated, approach to it, and they've gone sort of the opposite direction and pushed podcasting out to one area and music to another. Spotify tends to be more spot on to what people want. It just seems odd that Apple went in opposite direction.
Apple are right across it at the moment. I don't know if you may or may not have seen, but there's an app on the iPad called DJ, which I use it on my laptop as well. It's one of the sort of most widely downloaded DJ apps. And Algorithm, who make it, posted on their LinkedIn feed today, their visit, loads of photos from their visit by Tim Cook. That's a single app vendor who's tightly integrated with Spotify, but has their main market shop windows on the iTunes store and so on.
It's funny. I just looked at my phone and I have DJ on there. It's because it was a free app of the week a while back, and I think I downloaded it. So you're saying that, but that's an iOS app, as you say. That's not Apple proper doing it.
No, that's not Apple proper doing it, but Tim Cook showing that much interest in a particular app vendor is, and at a marketable level, is noticeable. And I think it plays into what I'm saying about people who are developing good, innovative tools for the prosumer level creator. I think are very wise at the moment. I think that space, people like Algorithm, I think are very well positioned. I saw, if you watched the Facebook demos on their stand at IBC, they were all about empowering Facebook Live producers to do better quality content, titling, and learning more about the traditional production sort of strategies to doing better quality events.
So, Virginia, from a cobble cord standpoint, if I go think about Make Studios and some of these others who created content, and then YouTube, who's created these in certain cities, they've got these creator studios. Do you see a model, when we talked about helping to grow eyeballs for an OTT service, do you see a model of an aggregator actually offering a sort of production facility to do this type of thing as well? or do people have enough technology at their fingertips already that they don't need to go into sort of a professional space?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Something I haven't really thought through, but I could certainly see that being another sort of offshoot to the unlimited possibilities that we're seeing in this industry. I think that the aggregators are making are looking for a big play and a bigger, more profitable play. And, I actually have some reticence about that because, that could inevitably lead to bundling again. And bundling is great when it saves people money, but not when it forces them and force feeds them, stuff that they don't want. And they're trapped in this bloated bundle.
Which is what the whole Telecommunications Act of '96 was supposed to get rid of, and of course didn't.
Right. So I have some trepidation, that we might see, a march towards this again. I'm strongly opposed to it. We're very much about empowering the consumer. So, there could be some of these added sort of value offerings that could be tacked on as differentiators, perhaps, and help these maybe smaller, maybe not the aggregators, but maybe the smaller guys sort of get an edge into the market.
To start growing eyeballs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
yeah.
Interesting. And then Chris, to you talked at the beginning where you did high-level events, Parliament, Robbie, etc. So we're 20 some odd years on from that. What's your sense about sort of production values and the need for professional services as opposed to, as you say, just girls putting makeup on in their bedroom with their iPhone?
I think there's a big market for large event production. There's a couple of companies that are doing that really well at the moment. For example, Jack Shoots are basically my production team from MediaWave a long time ago. They're still doing it now. They're doing live broadcasting, turn it into videos for streaming online. They're doing a lot of that for some big artists around the world. I think that whole production value isn't lost, and the BBC have started to move some of their broadcast channels to internet only. So BBC Three is one of the channels which is entirely geared towards online viewing.
Okay.
And so I think that like this podcast here today, there's going to be a lot more. Sorry about that. My battery's just going down. So there's going to be a lot more functionality put into apps so that you can have a remotely controlled MCR like you're doing at the moment, and swapping the cameras from all around the world. All of that functionality is going to become condensed into very cheap applications which people will distribute around the world, and there'll be lots of television channels that are distributed globally. So I think that production value has got to come into play, and it is coming into play at the moment. It's coming in very, very cheaply. And if you can get people like Dom running around developing apps like this, all the better.
All right, so Dom, back to you on the wrap up. What conferences? You mentioned conferences. What conferences are you going to? I think there's one in Sweden. Is that right?
I can tell you one I'm doing.
Please do.
I'm going to the Music Week Tech Summit on Tuesday at the Excel Centre in London. It's going to be a brilliant event for the music industry to learn about stuff that's going on in the music industry. And if anyone wants to go along to that, I would absolutely recommend it if you care anything about the music industry, like I do.
You might well find me there, Chris. You might well find me there. That sounds like a good one.
Yeah, it's only £200, but it's definitely worth going.
Nice.
Cool.
That's nice. So Dom, Sweden?
Yeah, so Streaming Tech Sweden is exactly 1 month today, so I will be handing the extremely complicated SMAF reins to you, Tim, to run for the next edition.
Great,
So good luck with that. But I will be speaking, I'll be giving the first of 2 deliveries of a presentation, which I have here, all done, ready, because I'm so organised, on 31 years of IP multicast. So I'm going to be talking about the challenge, the evolution of multicast from its inception through to some of the commercial deployments, the pitfalls and the struggles and so on, and also where we're seeing multicast-like technology still emerging in the 5G and in the traditional broadcast space as well. So that'll be getting its first run exactly 1 month today. I think I'm finished in time to make it up to my hotel room and join SMAF. But if not, then apologies in advance. So.
Well, if not, we'll just have you actually, we'll cut away to you making your presentation or something like that. Virginia, you're New York based, right?
Like
so
yeah.
NAB New York. Okay.
NAB New York is coming up, and also TV Week. So in New York. So there's some interesting streaming offshoots of that.
And I have to put a plug in for an audio show that comes along with NAB New York. In fact, the reason that NAB New York is there because it used to be the NAB radio show. This is AES, which is for the hardcore audio engineers. That show actually shares the floor with NAB New York. There's this giant column that you go around and suddenly it's all about audio mixers and that kind of thing. I attended that show last year and I'm actually strongly considering attending that this year. Of course, we've got Streaming Media West coming up in mid-November, which Eric will be chairing and has mentioned a number of the keynotes from. Dom, I'm going to hand it back to you to wrap it up.
Yeah, we'll definitely do some preview of Streaming Media West in the next show and so on, and we should have Mark back with us by then. So I think with let me just have a quick check on the calendar so I make sure I give you the right names for next month. But I think we've got Darren Norman and Ariane Hines on next month. So do join us for that on November the 7th when Tim will be struggling with all the controls rather than me. And of course, huge thanks to our guests, to Virginia.
Thank you.
There we go. And Chris.
You're very welcome. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. And Tim, thanks for hosting. Eric, in your absence, thanks for being there. I will do my best to piece together the archive and then send it out as a podcast over this evening. And for those of you that like a little bit of early 90s electronic dance music, I will be DJing at 11 o'clock on the Thursday night show. Eric will be DJing at 10, though, and he'll be playing a much more adult and respectable blues set. So hopefully see you then. Thanks to everyone. We look forward to seeing you next time.